Hey, AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've just been informed that I can broadcast for up to 8 hours. We won't need that long. We'll only be here for roughly an hour today as we talk about, well, basically anything you want to talk about, dealing with time period 2 in preparation for the period 2 exam. So I have the chat open, ready to go. Let me know if you have any specific questions. I talked about going about this this live review session a little differently and focusing on one key concept at a time. Now, making sure that we stay within those key concepts, that's nearly impossible. I would say key concepts bleed over into others pretty easily. So really to get started, I guess I will solicit questions dealing with key concept 2.1, focusing mainly on religion to start. I figure that's going to be what maybe perhaps we may need the most help with. And then we'll get into empires, which we spent a great deal of time on in class, followed by trade networks, which we ended with in this unit. So if you have questions, I may or may not have the answer, depending on whether or not you stump me. So let's go ahead and get started tonight. We will pick it up with here. So just in general, let me talk about the test a little bit too. 35 multiple choice questions on our test, though this will be helpful for all your tests to come, including your AP exam. So let's start. First thing is a question generally about Buddhism. Do you need to know the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment? If you know those are foundational ideas of Buddhism, you're going to be fine. You don't have to know the specific Four Noble Truths about suffering and all that. That's, again, this course is not necessarily aimed at memorization of things like that. Instead, we're focusing on the trends. So you may see on this test or in future tests something about, say, or maybe an excerpt from a writing about the Buddha, and it may mention the Four Noble Truths. You may want to generally understand that comes out of Buddhism, and that the Eightfold Path is kind of set forth by the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, to achieve nirvana, right? The path of getting rid of all desire. Generally, that's probably all you need to know. If you know them, then kudos. Next question is, what specifics of each religion are we required to know? Well, this isn't a theology class, though that would be fantastic if we had the time to really dive in to these religions a little bit more deeply. But we want to think about trends. Remember, this course is all about trends in history. In time period 2, the overall trend with religion is that the development of these religions and religious and cultural traditions, the code of these religions develop and they are codified. So we see in this unit that the moral codes that come out of religion, the bonds that come out of religion, really shape all aspects of society. Now, they may shape the social hierarchy. They may shape even the way people interact with their government, or the way government gains legitimacy from their people. What you do need to know is that there are two religions that appear in time period 1 and are codified, or pretty much codified in this time period. They're written down. Their rules and their regulations and their laws and their customs and their what's the word I'm looking for? Their rituals are kind of written down and set in place. And those religions are Judaism and Hinduism. Judaism is the first of our monotheistic religions. Um, the Holy Book comes into being. The Torah is what we call the Holy Book of Judaism. Um, and it will form a foundation that is extremely important for understanding the development of Christianity and, well, later on, the development of Islam even. The other religion, which continues from our last period into this period, is Hinduism. And you need to know really where both of these religions come from. Remember, Hinduism develops out of the Vedic traditions of South Asia. Hinduism is the basis for the caste system. It's basis for, we talked about some of the tenets earlier today, you know, the idea of doing one's duty or their dharma in order to, with the ideas of karma, right? And eventually, if you do one's duty, you can be reincarnated to a higher and higher caste until you achieve moksha, or that is oneness with Brahman, the overall spirit of Hinduism. So the Judaism, of course, comes out of basically Mesopotamian religious cultural values, and it develops, though, as a monotheistic religion. Hinduism, we don't really classify as monotheistic or polytheistic. Yes, there are sort of many gods, but they're all different ways that Brahman reveals himself to the world. So it's tough to classify it either way. I'm sure that an argument can be made in both directions. But that's probably the mainstays of what you need to know about Judaism and Hinduism, or the big stuff for the course. There are new religions that develop in this time period. We named them today in class. Buddhism and Christianity are two of the most significant because they spread. Christianity mostly in the Mediterranean and Buddhism mostly along the Silk Road. Other religions that develop, Taoism, that's the other big one from this time period. Zoroastrianism really starts kind of at the turning point of each of these, though it's more localized to Persia. Now, what do you need to know about those? Well, Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism. The Buddha, Siddhartha, he founds Buddhism around 500 or so, and he rejects many parts of Hinduism, specifically rejects the caste system and the idea that you have to go through these priests to interact with God. And so he also believed that all desire led to suffering, and so he rejects a lot of what he sees in the Hindu world, and kind of puts forth that Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path stuff that we were talking about momentarily. A lot of aspects of Buddhism get absorbed back into Hinduism, which is why we don't see Buddhism have such a stronghold in India in the long term. But it certainly spreads within India at first because of the Emperor Ashoka, and then later on through trade. Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, and it's based on the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who Christians refer to as Jesus Christ. The religion itself is spread by his followers, especially through the Mediterranean to different cities. It takes hold, especially with the lower classes. Buddhism and Christianity both share some things in common. One is that they are appealing to lower classes, and it makes sense. They both promise something later on, right? Christianity promises a good afterlife, right? So what goes on in your earthly life, well, maybe it's not great, it's a bunch of crap and all that stuff. But if you live a good life, then in the afterlife you will be handsomely rewarded. Buddhism offered people in the lower class, perhaps that were in lower castes in the South Asian Hindu society, perhaps it offered them an escape from this rigid social class system because Buddhism rejected that. So even if you were a lower caste, you were just as able to achieve or find your way and achieve enlightenment in Buddhism more so than in Hinduism. So Both of these religions also, beyond just being something for the lower class, they both appeal to women. Early Christianity as well as early Buddhism offered women a way kind of out of some of the patriarchal conditions of society, especially if they joined nunneries or monasteries and the like. So, oh, that was probably, I rambled a little bit there, but those are I would say, the big ideas of religion. Now, there are belief systems, especially Confucianism in this time period, which are pretty significant. And if somebody has a question about that, we can answer it. We'll do no SAQ on this test. We will have an LAQ, but it will not be in class. Was there another religion that focused on the fact that there was suffering and an escape from it? Ooh, well, I think not all, but many religions tend to say that there is, suffering that exists on earth. Christianity talks about that too, and that there is like an afterlife, of a promise of paradise, perhaps. We see that Zoroastrianism had that idea of an afterlife, and living a good life. You could be judged the last day. In fact, Zoroastrianism in that way was very influential in Christianity. Islam will pick up with that. But I would say that focus on the fact that there was suffering and escape from it. I think Buddhism is the main one that comes to mind. Next question is again about the test. Is it structured the same as previous questions based on passages? Yes, that is a yes. Next question is about the Americas from Morgan. Are we required to know anything about the Americas? I can talk about that later on. There's nothing really with religion or belief systems that you need to know about the Americas. Perhaps that animism or the kind of ideas of the natural world, the spirits of the natural world interacting with the corporeal world, that exists in the Americas at this time. It continues from our previous time period. It will continue into the next in some regions of the Americas. There are some things with key concept 2.2. So if we can come back to that question in a little bit. Yes, you will have test correction options. Say we can answer some questions specifically about the format of the test later on. So let's, I'm going to try to stick with the questions on religion right now so we don't get too off track. A question about the Torah. There's a question, is it important to know that the Torah was the main reason Judaism formed? That I wouldn't say that it's the main reason Judaism formed. Judaism was forming, and some of those basic ideas, some of those beliefs of Judaism are recorded in the Torah, or the Jewish holy book. These are the first 5 books that make up the Old Testament of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. And they issue laws for the Jewish people, again, codifying the belief system of Judaism. Judaism itself, as a monotheistic religion, had already formed. There were many stories of Judaism, a great deal of history that connected the Hebrew ethnic group together. They trace their history back to Abraham, who is considered to be kind of the first monotheist. He's like the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We'll talk more about that in the next unit. But it is one way that this religion becomes, and the beliefs of the religion become codified or written down so that they are less arguable. So another question, why did Buddhism do better in areas like China, Southeast Asia rather than in India? And I kind of hinted at an answer earlier. And so this question may have been asked before I was able to get to that. But I will say it again because it is important. Buddhism is founded in India. It does spread in India in the Mauryan dynasty, especially under Ashoka, as I said, who converts to Buddhism, constructs pillars all around his empire with his edicts. The edicts of Ashoka, which were mentioned in your reading, oftentimes come up in this class. But he was very tolerant of other religions, but definitely emphasizes or I guess advertises Buddhism to the empire. But over time, there are people who there is a kind of a backlash against Buddhism, so to speak. Not everyone is open to Buddhism in the Mauryan Empire, and then because Hinduism is so flexible in a way that it can absorb outside influences. We see that over and over again throughout history with Hinduism. It is able to basically take the things from Buddhism that it particularly likes, so to speak, and it absorbs it back into Hindu practices in certain regions of India. And so basically the good stuff, the stuff people like, can certainly be practiced without abandoning the at this point 1,000-year tradition of what becomes Hinduism. So now, why did it do better in other places? Well, Buddhism spreads along the Silk Roads, it spreads into China, and Buddhism itself, as it spreads, becomes malleable as well. It does well blending with many other traditions, religious traditions, especially as it spreads outside of its kind of area of development. And so, in a way, it finds that same success outside of India that Hinduism is able to find within. There's a question here about something I'd mentioned earlier. I said the Buddha had rejected many parts of Hinduism. The question is asking me to clarify, did I mean that he did not believe in them, or he actively condemned them, or both? So it is my understanding, though, I think I would encourage you to go and do a little bit more research into it. It is my understanding that from just what I've heard and what I've listened to, that the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, had generally people agree that he was kind of a princely figure. He was definitely from an upper class, sheltered, growing up, raised with Hinduism, and that as the story goes, he goes outside the palace walls and he sees all this suffering and he starts contemplating it. My understanding is that, yes, he does reject the ideas that the caste system is in place. So I think not believing in them, condemning them, I would say kind of both, the caste system and the idea of this priestly Brahma class, he does reject. Those terms could, if you're looking at this from like a scholarly standpoint, and you are like a scholar of Hinduism and Buddhism, perhaps you might use those words really specifically in a way that I am not meaning to. But I'm kind of, I would say, the extent of my knowledge on that. So I'd encourage you to look into it a little bit more. But my understanding is, yes, that he did condemn them. He did not think that was the way the world worked or how to achieve enlightenment. Let's see. Are there symbols or texts that we should recognize and immediately associate with a certain religion? Yes. So that's a really great question. That's something we didn't really spend much time in class on. And I would encourage you, if I'm clicking, let me click around here and see if I can find. So in general, if you see the image of a cross, for example, that is going to be associated with Christianity. This is important because, for example, we know Christianity spread along the Silk Road, and it spread all the way out to China, for example. And we know that because we see images of crosses in China, etc. That type of Christianity was mainly Nestorian Christianity. And it was condemned basically in the Mediterranean after the Council of Nicaea, and those people who practiced it and followed it, they kind of went down the Silk Road and spread their religion to the east. What's interesting, though, is Nestorian Christianity encounters Central Asian steppe nomads who incorporate parts of it into their kind of shamanistic practices. And so the cross itself, for some of those people, kind of becomes like a good luck charm, or a kind of like a talisman or something along those lines. Whereas it has, of course, a much different and deeper meaning, perhaps. No, maybe I shouldn't judge how deep the meaning is to these people. for Christians, let's say, in the Mediterranean. And so the cross itself, certainly a sign of Christianity. If you see that, then it's going to be a clue that it's a Christian document. The symbol that is often associated with Taoism is the yin and yang symbol. The symbol that's often associated with Judaism is the Star of David. So those are the big ones that I can think of. I can search real quick. Oftentimes, if you just like look these up in Wikipedia, which is always great, that the symbols will pop up for each. So, for example, Buddhism, I'm just searching it right now very quickly, and the image of a the wheel of Dharma shows up, is what it is called. So it is a teaching wheel. It's got like 8 points. In Wikipedia, it's yellow. I don't think that's it has to be. I don't know. But I would just say, like, take a look at there for those things. For Islam, usually which we'll get into next unit, doesn't come around this unit. The crescent is usually the and sometimes crescent and star are the symbol for Islam. So there are some symbols to be identified. That you won't get a question like that typically on the test. A question about Judaism. We're talking about Ashkenazi or Sephardic or both. I was speaking generally about Judaism. There are lots of different beliefs within Judaism. There were lots of different beliefs within Judaism when Christianity comes around, which is one reason why early Christians were just seen as a sect of Judaism. They were kind of seen as Jewish, and that begins to change as Christians fashion themselves as a brand new religion, not just an offshoot of Judaism. So what I've been talking about Judaism is more general. Again, we think about trends in this class. We don't dive too much into all the nuances, for better or for worse. A question about animism. Is it a belief system or a religion? And how much need you know about it? So animism itself is kind of a category of religions, usually incorporating what I would consider to be natives or nativist or non-codified religions that specifically, I would say, have a belief that there is a spirit world. There is something in the natural world, this spirit over many spirits, whatever they might be, and they interact with the human or corporeal world. So we see this a lot in Native American religions. We see it a lot in sub-Saharan African religions. We see it a lot in hunter-gatherer religious beliefs. I would just say that as far as what you need to know about it, generally know that this is a category of religions that can be wide-ranging, but it basically encapsulates a type of like non-codified religion that focuses more on the reliance on the natural world and not so much on performing the right rituals and saying the right things in a sacrifice to your God so that your God makes sure food grows the next year, something along those lines. Do you need to remember the Hindu laws of Manu? So there is the laws of Manu are a really interesting thing. We didn't talk about them directly, but it is significant, especially with the ideas of patriarchy. The laws of Manu themselves are Hindu laws that deal, in a great deal at least, in part with the relationship between men and women. And they certainly put in place patriarchal codes. Women in these laws must be subject to their husband or their father first, then later to their husband, and then to their sons. And somebody brought that up in class today, and it was a real good connection. the idea that like women were never independent. You oftentimes see these laws of Manu um, in you may see it in tests or test questions, and it'll ask you to compare them to other laws or to look at them kind of with the context of patriarchy. I don't know if it was in the reading I gave you on. I'm pulling out a book where I pulled a reading for you on South Asia. Another thing is just generally know they are located in South Asia. I'm double checking to see if they were mentioned in it. Doesn't look like they were mentioned by name. And I can't remember off the top of my head when they were written. They may slightly predate this time period. A quick Wikipedia search will remind me of that. But at times, no, they were written about 200 BCE, so they would fit in this time period. Regardless, it talks about the code of conduct for caste relationships in India and the relationships between men and women. So again, codifying some of those beliefs that were present, writing them down. And then, of course, you can expect people to follow them if they're written down and perhaps follow them the same way from generation to generation. So we're going to wrap up with this. I'm going to take one more question, two more questions dealing with key concept 2.1, and then we can move on to 2.2. Is Taoism considered a religion or a philosophy? Good question. I think Taoism we would consider to be, well, one, it certainly is a belief system. I would normally place it in the idea of a religion in much the same way Buddhism is. It teaches about people living in harmony with the way. The idea that there is this kind of guiding spirit or guiding thing, the Tao, that is that one has to get in touch with. So I think I'd probably place it in there. Again, usually when asked on a test, you were asked mainly about belief systems, not religion specifically. So often, obviously, these fall into belief systems, although almost any religion, you're going to have philosophy based on that religious point of view. And so certainly there is Taoist philosophy. But I would probably put it in, certainly in the religion category. Again, don't get too bogged down in that. The main distinction I wanted to make was about Confucianism, because it is Confucian philosophy or Confucian way of thought certainly blends with Taoist beliefs, certainly blends with Buddhist beliefs or traditional Chinese beliefs and ancestor worship to create kind of a well-defined, what we would consider to be Chinese culture in the classical era. So let's move on to there's one more question. What are some of the most important forms of artistic expression that would be useful to know? Really great question there. I would say the key concepts, let me pull those up. For some reason, I don't have them up on my computer screen, which I need to do. Let's see what it mentions specifically. I would say certainly like some aspects of literature, if you think about like Greek literature, the works of Homer and those kind of foundational works of Greek literature might be important. In thinking about Greek architecture, certainly with Hellenism and the Hellenistic age, that is important. Let's see if there's any others that come up when I look here. They may have removed that. Take a look. Take a look at Freemanpedia and AP Worldopedia. Let me go to that screen and see if they mention any specifically. Let's see. Actually, artistic expression is mentioned specifically in Freemanpedia's one-pagers, which I love, love, love. So if you take a look at Freemanpedia's one-pager, talks about literature and drama. I would say certainly with Perhaps Taoist poetry would be something that you definitely need to know. It doesn't mention something specific literature in this, but I would say Taoist poetry, um, uh, Roman or uh, Greek, perhaps dramas or Greek epics might play a role in terms of examples of artistic expression. There are some distinct architectural styles that are mentioned here. So certainly Greek building styles, um, Hindu temples, etc. And we can look at more examples of those in our class in the next unit. We look at architecture a little bit more in Unit 3. And then it says, talking about syncretism, looking at syncretic culture, usually blends of Buddhist and Greek architecture comes up a lot in that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for that one, but luckily Freemanpedia comes to the rescue. So take a look at that. I fully endorse it. All right. So another question. If you have any more questions, I want to move to key concept 2.2 as I answer Zach's question on ancestor veneration. So if you have any questions about the development and states of developments of states and empires, or any of our empires in this time period, ask them, and I will do my best to answer them. But Zach was asking about ancestor veneration. That we usually associate ancestor veneration with China. It originates, that's one of kind of the basic traditional Chinese religious aspects. And yeah, so the idea that you would honor your ancestors and perhaps build like altars to your ancestors. It's picked up with Buddhism. Buddhism in ways merges with that idea of ancestor veneration in China. And that's where we get the idea of like bodhisattvas, etc. The AP Worldopedia, I think, has some pretty good info on that. So that's where I'll point you if you want any more about that. So let's move on to key concept 2.2, which is not so much about religion, but about politics. This is the formation of empires, how empires used specific tools, some which they invented and some which they were improving upon older state techniques to build larger, bigger, better, badder empires than they ever had before. So let's take a look at what our questions are. Will there be anything about the two types of, here we have jus gentium and jus civil, basically the general law and the civil law of Rome. You probably will see something about that. That's a pretty significant concept. So one thing to know about these empires, they were extremely diverse. They were large, diverse. That's means that you need to adapt your laws to that situation, right? You have a large empire. You have to have something in that empire to keep order, perhaps something that can be a law that everybody everywhere knows to follow. But depending on where you are in Rome, whether you're in Palestine, you're Jewish in Palestine, or you are a pagan, or you're a believer in Roman polytheism in Rome, or you believe in Egyptian polytheism in Egypt, or perhaps you are a Greek. Every area will have different social norms. They will have different different things that they consider to be acceptable behavior, etc. And so Rome had this general law, right? This jus gentium, it's called, and that general law code of Rome basically put into place a law for all peoples, all nations. There's universal principles that are true of all folks. And at least the Romans said this was the case. And so they had this general law. We can think of it as kind of like a very broad federal law, as we might think of it today. And in each region of Rome, they had more specific laws, the civil law, the local law, that were customized to fit the special circumstances or local conditions. So those might have to deal with the um, trade rituals, or how trade was conducted, or how courts ran, or perhaps punishments for certain laws. Perhaps they could all agree that stealing was wrong, but in certain regions, perhaps stealing was treated much differently than in other regions. So these laws had to be based on, they had to be generally flexible in Rome, right? We're dealing with a large, diverse empire. You can't have rigid laws in places, in all places necessarily. So that is the basic idea of this Roman law code, which is what I would say one of the legacies of Rome, right? The Roman Empire leaves its legacy of law. It's going to be picked up by Justinian in our next time period. He's going to take Roman law. He's going to use the basic principle of the law of all nations and the local civil law, and he will refine that code to fit with the beliefs of a Christian Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, and that will form law. That will influence law in Europe. Elements of Roman law are going to be adopted by even like Germanic tribes as they set up what might be seen as like their own states, right? So Roman law is going to be very influential in history, and it's because of that unique development of that general law code with some flexibility for the changes in local law. All right. I think I answered that question. Hopefully we can be all right. So a question about general timeline for empires. Sure. Let me see if I have something to write on right now. In 1 second. All right. So I found something to write on. So when we think about this what is going on here in this time period, we are between two dates. We're between 600 BCE and 600 CE here. Okay. And right there in the middle is like our year 1 CE. All right. So depending on what empire we're talking about, they last different lengths. I would say you don't get yourself bogged down in specific dates. All right. If we were to think about like the Persian Empire, the Persian Empire it has kind of like 3 major times you have to know. The beginning with like the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid begins in like about 550. It lasts until Alexander the Great in like 320 or so. BCE. The Parthian Empire lasts from roughly like 200 BCE to 200 CE. That's like always a really good date. Like if you're not quite sure, like the Parthian Empire, the Han Empire, the high point of Rome, those are all about between 200 BCE and 200 CE. So what I would advise you to do is just like make like a little timeline or something along those lines. So like, putting them on here, but for the most part, 200 BCE to 200 CE, we have like the Parthian Empire, which we didn't talk much about. Just know that they are an iteration of the Persian Empire, that they were a center of trade for the Silk Road, like many of these empires were. Rome, the Han Dynasty, Parthian Empire, they're all kind of located on the Silk Road during this time. The Parthians were rivals to Rome. They were they fight with Rome kind of in the eastern area of the Roman Empire, I guess the western edge of the Parthian Empire. And so Rome's kind of big, the other power, I guess, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then later on, the last pre-Islamic empire for the Persians is the Sassanid Empire. We didn't talk a whole lot about them. I mean, they were another powerful Persian empire because of where they were located. Eventually, they fall to the Islamic caliphates. So when we think about Persia, it's there pretty much for this entire time period, just in three different iterations. Now, China is a little different. If we think about China, I'm about to show you what I'm writing on here. We have a very short-lived empire, and that is the Qin Empire, that is then followed by an empire that lasts for about 200 or 400 years or so. Let's see if you can get this in there. The Qin dynasty, again, is only one person long. The only leader of the Qin dynasty is Qin Shi Huangdi. But in its roughly 15 years or so of existing, it united China. It centralized the government. It created a bureaucracy. It built the Great Wall. It standardized weights and measures. It standardized the Chinese written language, really putting into place through legalist practices what will come to really set China up, at least the Han Dynasty, up for success later on, centralizing the government. Because before then, China had roughly been decentralized, fairly feudal. The Han Dynasty picks up from there, and that is one of China's golden ages. It is an empire that, of course, trades along the Silk Road. They go through they create a lot of things. They build the capital city at Chang'an. They create an educated bureaucracy. They incorporate Confucianism into Chinese government. They kind of start out more legalist, but they realize that Confucianism had a system of education already set up that they could tap into in order to get the best, smartest, brightest people into their bureaucracy. And so that's how we see kind of the inroads of Confucianism into Chinese government. So, and of course, the Silk Road really develops under the Han Dynasty. At the same time, you have the Parthians and the Romans at their height. Of course, that supports trade. I don't know if me drawing this out kind of works for the for the empires of India. I tend to remember this by thinking about the fact both of these empires, the Mauryan and the Gupta, are kind of mirror each other on either side of kind of our 1 CE swap over date. So the Mauryan Empire begins about the year 300 BCE and ends around, I think it's like 180 or so BCE. The Gupta Empire begins in about 300 CE and ends right at the end of this time period, around 600 CE. So if we were to put them on there, it would look something like so. All right, so we've got our Persians up here. We've got our Chinese empires here and Indian empires. Now you notice that there are a large gap in there where India is not dominated by any one empire. That is what India is like for most of its history. It is, I mean, even the Guptan Empire did not conquer as much land as the Mauryan. India, because of its geography, it's very diverse geographically. From the north to the south, you have the Deccan Plateau in there. You have it's going to be very difficult to conquer such a region, a region that can be so different in different parts, because you're going to deal with different cultures. You're going to deal with barriers, geographic barriers, to really making sure that you can get a stronghold on that region. So that's something to consider, why you have that gap in India. Other empires you know, Rome pretty much lasts this whole time. I happen to know the dates for Rome just because I've taught it a lot. So Rome begins in 509 BCE as just like like a city, like the Roman city-state. And then it slowly takes over the Italian peninsula. Then, fights some wars, defeats the Carthaginians, wins lots of land in the the Western Mediterranean, conquers the Eastern Mediterranean and Greece and all that, eventually encompassing the whole Mediterranean, really reaching its height somewhere between 200 BCE and 200, 300 CE or so. But it will continue all the way until the year 476 CE. So a lot of this time. And it that's when the western part of the empire falls. The eastern portion of the Roman Empire continues on until the year 1453 CE. So if you consider the Byzantine Empire as a continuation of the Roman Empire, then it went on much longer. And if you consider the Russian Empire, because the Russian Tsar married the daughter of the last Byzantine Empire, if you consider that part of Rome, well, then it's still going on. But we don't consider that. So don't think that. But Rome, of course, undergoing difficulties, splits into two main governing regions, the East and the West. And as a result, the Western part crumbles due to, well, a number of things, which you read about a couple nights ago. And yeah, and it crumbles. But the Eastern part stays very strong, mainly because of trade. The Western part of the empire, kind of trade crumbles. It becomes, it falls apart, becomes feudal. And in the Eastern part, trade's still going strong. The Byzantine Empire is trading the Black Sea, trading with the Silk Road, trading in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, they are closer to other empires, so that makes sense. And they are not having to deal with barbarian invasions as a result of some natural defenses and stronger economics, which can then, fund the military, so to speak. Whew, that was a lot. I don't know if this helped you at all, but there are certainly a lot of websites where you can go and take a look at some of the timelines of history. The dates are not as terribly important as you might think, as long as you can fit them within the 600 to 600 range. You generally know that the Qin come before the Han, the Mauryan come before the Gupta. Those are some basic things. Okay. We have to know about smaller civilizations that are not imperial, such as Aksum. Always good to know. It's certainly brought up in your book. And it's important to understand that while these major states and empires are developing, there are states on the periphery that are still engaging in trade, still developing. This is certainly something we see with the Americas. You have the Mayan civilization, which is a collection of city-states. We'll talk more about that in our next unit. I kind of go back and dip back into this time period for that. So yes, they are important. They could be some really great examples for writing that you have, and you may see some questions about it. They are not mentioned expressly in the key concepts, but knowing the traits of civilization, the traits of state building in this time period, knowing some of those good peripheral empires is good for you. All right. Speaking of groups on the periphery, one thing that I haven't really talked to you about was specific invaders. And this was in your reading on the decline of these classical empires. But there are some specific groups that you do need to know about these nomadic groups that people dealt with on their borderlands. And the ones that you need to know, there's three of them. The Han Empire dealing with the Xiongnu, Xoing, Xiongnu, N-U, Xio, GNU, something along those lines. Look it up. But the Han had to deal with these nomadic groups on their borderland over and over again. That was very costly for the Han dynasty. It's very expensive, which can also throw your government into disarray when you're having to spend that much money. These are basically invaders, nomadic invaders. The Gupta Empire had a tough time with the what we call the White Huns in the Hunnic migrations, and those Hunnic migrations kind of started that domino effect of other migrations into Rome, where we see the Germanic tribes on the Roman borders. Those are the ones that I would say are important to know generally. Do we have to know what each location, India and China and Silk Road, produced? Again, be able to recognize some of the goods produced. I think that's certainly important. And you should generally know some of the items that are produced and traded in the Silk Road. Yes. The production of silk in China, of course, is where the name comes from. So know that one. Later on, we're going to talk about porcelain and the importance of porcelain in trade. That's not quite in this unit. In India, black pepper is probably the big one. Cotton textiles. Of course, cotton itself spreads to Persia. Gems, things like that from India. Those are the high value, low weight goods. Rome is going to be trading like wine, olive oil, wheat across the Mediterranean as they import it. We need to know about the workings of the Han, Mayan, and Roman armies. I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of people pointing up arrows to this. I don't know what you mean about the workings. I would say that you don't need to know how these armies, like how they were made up, or like how people interacted within those militaries. For this course, I would say no. Yeah, that would be my short answer to that. I think AP Worldopedia may have a little bit. I'm pulling it up here. There might be some comparisons, I think, with the Han and Mayan armies, in that there is some stuff about those armies. Feel free to look at that and read that over. I don't think that will hurt. I don't think I ask anything about it on this test, and I really haven't seen much about it on other tests, but I know there's a little bit of reading on that in AP Worldopedia, and I, of course, encourage you to read anything from that website. Again, really great site. Do you need all the causes of the collapse of empires? Yes. And I'm not going to go over all of those because there is a very specific reading on that topic. I mean, I know I already talked about the people on the nomadic invasions, but I've already generally talked about the you have a reading on the collapse of empires. So, and if you're for some reason like watching this and you don't take my class or something, or you're watching this later on, then go to AP Worldopedia and there will be some stuff on there. All right, so it looks like questions on empires have dried up a little bit, and that's probably because we spent a lot more time on that. So I'll answer a few questions here before we end. I'll end about 9:20 on trade, which is another topic which we dealt with. We dealt with it last, so probably won't be as many questions here, but I will answer them while they are here. Now, do you need to know all the geographical areas that all the major trade networks connected? That is a resounding yes. One thing that when we were working on practice thesis statements, some people I think had some misconceptions about where the trans-Saharan trade went. So keep in mind that the Sahara Desert is within North Africa, and that's it. This is not a trade network that expands to Arabia or the Middle East. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and look at the maps that you used to study for your map test. The trans-Saharan trade connected North Africa with sub-Saharan Africa. That is the region south of the Sahara Desert that makes up West, Central, and East Africa as well. But mostly this trade was between North Africa and West Africa. Really picks up in our next time period. Begins about 300 CE. The Indian Ocean connects East Africa, Arabia, South Asia, Southeast Asia together in a maritime system. The Silk Roads connect China, South Asia, Central Asia, especially the Middle East and Europe along a series of trade routes. And then the Mediterranean connects Europe, West Asia, and North Africa together. So those are the the big guys. And yes, you do need to know the geographical areas that they connect. Next question, will we need to know about the Mesoamerican civilizations or the Andes civilizations? So this unit does cover these civilizations. Specifically in Mesoamerica, in central Mexico, the Teotihuacan civilization, which is based around the city of Teotihuacan, which is one of the few names that I can pronounce. This city, this imperial city, you could say, really forms the center of that civilization. The Teotihuacan civilization will be a more kind of like a foundational civilization, kind of like the Olmecs, for what will eventually become much later on, like the Aztecs, after a couple other groups come along. They're known for like pottery and a little bit of trade in the region, but we don't see long distance trade really in much long distance trade in Mesoamerica. The Mayans are probably the most significant, I would say, to know for this time period. They disappear somewhere around the year 900, but they definitely peak in time period 2. They're known for building the Mayan pyramids. They're known for pretty advanced mathematics. They're certainly known for their calendar, which predicted the end of the world in like 2012. And then there was like a really bad movie made about it. Don't sue me, whoever made that movie. It's just an opinion. And they are also known for their advances in astronomy. So they're even like, you can go look up like Mayan observatories and stuff where they would observe the stars. That was important for their calendar. In South America, the Moche civilization, one of our foundational civilizations, keeps going through this time period. Not much that I can think of that you need to know in this time period for them off the top of my head. We'll get to them. We'll go back and do a little bit with all these civilizations when we are dealing with the Americas in our next couple units. So in terms of thinking about the history of the Americas, it is important in this time period. But as far as contextualizing the rest of history that we're studying, we use that more so to contextualize what's going to come and what the Americas is going to look like on the eve of Columbus arriving and screwing everything up. Okay, next question. We'll take a couple more. Did you need to know about the plagues mentioned in the review pages? So there are some plagues. I'm not exactly sure which ones are mentioned in the review pages. Let me pull up. I have here Freemanpedia. I see what you're mentioning. The plague of Galen, the plague of Justinian, the plague of Cyprian. I've never required anybody to know these specifics. Although, if you were writing about empires coming to an end, they would be excellent examples of or excellent specific evidence that you could use if you're talking about the spread of disease, for example. One thing we talked about in our that could have been in our last practice LEQ, or our practice LEQ when we were writing our thesis statements, an excellent example of a similarity is that, trade networks spread disease, something along those lines. So just know that, smallpox was a disease. Just treat them as examples of some of those things that we've been learning about. The smallpox killing 5 million people in Rome. The plague of Justinian comes along later. We'll talk a little bit about that next unit. But the big thing is that diseases also spread along these trade routes, and they can have devastating effects for empires. Remember that, let's say a plague kills 10% of a population. Well, that's 10% of the people who can't work. That's 10% less tax money. That is infrastructure failing. That is your army weakening. It is a whole host of things that can happen. 10% of people disappearing, not working, can have a greater than 10% effect sometimes on a population. And if a lot of those people you got to imagine, who are susceptible to diseases are younger, well, then that's going to lead to problems generationally. Now, that would be, let's just say, like 10%. The plague of Galen killed about 1/3 of the Roman population, is estimated. So that is that's pretty significant, and it can cause some difficulties in these empires. But overall, do you need to memorize the names? No, you don't for my test. Question: are there any questions on the Qanat system? Probably. Started in Iran or Persia, spread to the Middle East, even spread all the way to China, doubled the amount of water available for irrigation, for farming, allowing Persia to not only produce more food for itself, but also to start producing cotton. So, question about, so we have some questions here. I'm going to go through the trade routes. One last question here. What's the difference between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, and how and what they traded? Good question. So they both traded via a maritime system, right? We know that. The Indian Ocean relied on monsoon winds, whereas the Mediterranean did not rely on seasonal winds as such. Trade in the Mediterranean was pretty much year-round and didn't require monsoon winds coming out of South Asia and reversing to get back to South Asia. So the Mediterranean's trade was much easier in that way, I would say. The trade in the Mediterranean was certainly in this time period much more frequent and carried many more goods. Both of these trade networks dealt in heavy goods. I would say the Mediterraneans, you see a lot more trading in like wheat, wine, and olive oil than you might in the Mediterranean or in the Indian Ocean. But those goods perhaps made it into the Indian Ocean. They made it through the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea. And we do know, for example, that the Romans attained black pepper not necessarily just through the Silk Roads, but actually through maritime trade into the Red Sea, offloaded in Egypt, and then traded through the Mediterranean. So those are just some basic differences, I would say. So those are I think the questions that we've gotten, mainly about key concept 2.3. I think people feel a little bit more comfortable with that. As far as the test tomorrow, if you have any specific questions about that, go ahead and ask. Somebody said, are the questions contextualizing like the last test? Yes, you're going to be dealing with a lot of primary sources where you will use those to try to figure out the answers to the test. Sometimes they will contextualize the answers. Sometimes the answer will ask you to draw conclusions about the arguments made or to make comparisons between sources. It is 35 multiple choice questions, and it is, it's pretty straightforward. You'll get a minute per question. So I will have your answer sheets ready to go at the start of class. Come in. You need a pencil tomorrow. No pens tomorrow are needed. Come in ready to take the test. We really won't have time, given that it is a Friday, to have conversation about the test. So if you have any other questions, come see me at lunch in my classroom, room 126. That's it. I hope everybody had their questions answered today. If I missed anything, again, come see me tomorrow, shoot me an email, and I'll try to get back to you in the morning. Have a great night, and best of luck.